the reason why I wanted to help set up this APPG is that with the work that we've been doing through the issues that are affecting men and boys, family separation has become one of the most flagged issues. Just let's say, I recently went to an Andy's Man's Club, and 5 of the 20 people there were all struggling hugely with family separation. And I think one of the biggest problems that we've got in society is fatherless boys. So, but we thought it would be, obviously there's an issue there, surely, for motherless girls too. I do think it's something that we need to address across the board. It's a huge, I believe we've got 2.5 million separated families out there, and there's 4 million children to those 2.5 million separated families. And it's creating a huge issue, because no matter who's left looking after the child, one parent is always going to struggle to look after the home, bring up the children, and work, which is what they have to do. We've also come across issues during when, unfortunately, when a lot of unscrupulous, just let's say, solicitors get involved, then the blame, weaponizing children. All these issues come. Now, there's obviously an awful lot of people who work in this field who do put the children first, even though they obviously try to win a case, but there's many that don't. And we need to look at how we move forward with this, because unfortunately it's having such a damaging effect. 90,000 men are in prison, and the numbers of those that will be from broken families will be huge. I spoke to one lady who's been working with prisoners and getting them back into work, and she said the 9 young men that she'd taken in as part of this tranche of ex-prisoners coming to work for her factory, all 9 of them have come from broken homes. All 9 of them have been brought up without a male role model in their life. So it's definitely something that we need to work on. So that's the reason why I've got involved in it. That's the reason why I said I would chair it. And hopefully, with the APPG for issues affecting men and boys, we've had a win this weekend with the men's health strategy. It's not there yet, but there's some really good parts coming forward. So I think with Mike, with Mark, myself, and obviously the help of people on the panel and people within the room, we're not just going to be an APPG that makes a few noises and then moves on. We're actually going to make a difference, which is what we need to do. So thank you all, and really appreciate everybody who's joined in today. It's super important, but we should be able to do some good for once. Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's great. So Professor Ben Hine from University of West London is going to say a few words about changing our approach to separation, starting at the beginning. Over to you, Ben.
Hi, thank you very much for having me at this session. Over 2022, I worked with a number of fathers and organizations on the Lost Dads project, where we examined the experiences and outcomes of separation on fathers in a holistic way. From that project, we found some incredibly troubling things. So some of the top line figures were that 42% of men who were experiencing family breakdown and went and sought support were experiencing suicidal thoughts within the 12 months previously. And Nav from Dads Unlimited is going to speak more about that a bit later. We found widespread experiences of abuse, including alienating behaviors. We found unanimously negative experiences of the family court system and trying to negotiate parenting responsibility. And within the interviews that we did, again, this profound impact on mental health, resulting in a wide range of mental health difficulties, including suicide ideation. We also found that from the men and the organizations themselves, they reported that there was not enough support available, not just for men, but for separating couples in general. The specific recommendations from that report were to include some kind of mental health triage for men and to get that embedded on a much more wider scale, to visit things like having a 50-50 presumption of parental involvement and contact upon separation, unless a risk or otherwise presents itself, to engage in wide-scale reform of the family courts, and to challenge parenting stereotypes to place mothers and fathers on an equal footing from the get-go. Now, the interesting thing about that report was that whilst it was targeted on men, it actually illuminated much broader issues in relation to how we do separation in England and Wales and more broadly in the UK. We are not laying the foundations and we are not facilitating good post-separation family dynamics because of what we do at the start of family breakdown, but also what we do in intact relationships. The men in the study that we looked at, and a lot of the literature suggests that we do not have the policies and practice in place within intact relationships to get parents on an equal footing so that post-separation, they have the same kind of rights, they have the same kind of responsibilities. Moreover, when family breakdown occurs, we have a serious issue where there is no support available for separating couples. And we are leaving couples who are often in a place of extreme hurt and trauma to try and negotiate things in the best interest of children when they may be unable to do so because of the position they are in. So I can obviously share the report, and I'm happy to do so. And there are some gender-specific issues around fathers and what we need to do for them. And I can talk at length on those another time and in the other APPGs, for example, the one on men and boys and the one on fatherhood. However, what that report did is it contributed to a bigger discussion, a discussion within which the evidence is available, freely available. The evidence suggests that children are best, for example, in joint physical custody. The evidence suggests that fathers have a tremendous impact on the lives of children for the good. And we are currently, with the policies and practices that we have in the UK and the structures that we have, we are not following the evidence when it comes to separation and how to do it well. That is all the kind of time I think that I have for my little piece. But I'm really excited to work with this APPG and with anybody who is interested on fundamentally changing the way that we approach separation in this country. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Do we have any questions from the parliamentarians for Ben? Moving straight on to Philip Marcus. Philip Marcus is a retired judge from Jerusalem Family Court, but he did train in the UK. And it turns out that the system they have in Israel is somewhat superior. So we've asked him to come along and just very briefly outline in what ways their system works better.
Thanks very much, Mike, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to see that Baroness Butler-Sloss is part of this group. She was very kind nearly 30 years ago when I visited the courts, the family courts in England, and I was able to sit in on hearings in the High Court and in the Divorce County Courts and in the Principal Registry. So thank you very much to Baroness Butler-Sloss. The situation in Israel, as Mike says, is, I would think, somewhat better than what's going on in England and Wales. I published on the topic, anyone who's interested in seeing my papers, Mike will certainly be able to give you my email address. That there are a number of ways in which the Israeli family court system has developed since a specific family court law, which was passed in 1995. First of all, it's a specialist court staffed by specialist judges, which means that any judge who's hearing a family case is hearing family cases because he has experience in the field and because he is willing and able to sit for several years hearing specifically family cases. The judges, as well as their selection, there is an annual 3 or 4 day residential seminar, which all judges in the family courts are required and expected to attend, dealing with a variety of topics which they come across. So that's the first level, the idea of a specialist court. Secondly, Israeli legislation since 1951 has said that both the father and the mother are equally the guardians of the child, regardless of whether they were ever married, divorced, separated, or whatever. And that means that there is a presumption that they will both take and keep the responsibilities for looking after their children. That is a statutory presumption. Obviously, it can be rebutted in cases where it is clear or uncontrovertible that any contact between a child and one of the parents will cause lasting damage to the child. Then, and only then, will a court make a decision removing a child from any contact with a parent. And those cases are exceptionally rare for obvious reasons. The third issue is the extent to which children are involved in proceedings. We have set up a system whereby any child who is involved in proceedings is entitled to free representation by legal aid, regardless of means testing. And what that means is that there is a cadre of highly trained lawyers who represent children. They can bring the voice of the child before the court, but more importantly, in my view, they can add an important element, and that is they can meet with the lawyers representing the parents and crack their heads together and say, look, what you're doing is damaging the children, and thereby bring about an agreed resolution. The fourth issue I want to speak about is speedy handling of cases. I recently filed comments on the draft guidance on responding to allegations of alienating behavior published by the Family Justice Council. And there I emphasize that in Israel, there is a practice direction saying that in any case where parents are involved and there are allegations of abuse or neglect of a child, including interference with contact, there must be a hearing before a judge within 14 days of filing. And at that hearing, the judge is able to make orders about contact, make orders about representation of the child, make orders about the progress of the case, and can impose sanctions for non-compliance. And that's the last thing I want to mention. One of the complaints I hear from lawyers and judges around the world, and particularly in England and Wales, is that courts may spend a huge amount of time trying these cases and making decisions. But if there is no proper sanction for non-compliance, and a child, even though it's been ordered that they should see a parent and is not seeing a parent, where there's no sanction, the court is wasting its time and it's bringing itself into disrepute. In Israel, we have a robust system of sanctions for contempt of court, which include not only fines and imprisonment, but also making changes to the residential arrangements, but also a person who is non-compliant can be deprived of his driving license, deprived of his passport, and other restrictions can be imposed. And these are highly effective in causing compliance. Those are some of the ways in which we have developed things in Israel. I'll be happy to share, and I'm proud to have been invited as a former solicitor to take part in this group.
So now I'm going to introduce Sarah Squires, who's the director of she's a nurturing coach, and she's going to talk about why family breakdown is a mental health issue rather than a legal issue, which is clearly one of the mistakes we're making in the UK.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me here. So basically following on pretty much from what Ben was saying from the findings around the impact on men, but on women as well, of mental health, and how family breakdown is known to be one of the most stressful things we'll ever go through. Family breakdown is one of the most stressful things we'll ever go through, alongside death of a child, moving house, losing jobs, those kind of things. And it's a very emotive thing because we've decided that we want to be part of this clan, and we know that that's the safest place for children to be raised within. So when it breaks down, it triggers an emotional response. And the main areas that I see in our work, working with victims going through this, is emotional dysregulation, which essentially is the person able to self-regulate versus seeking someone else to regulate for them. the nervous system dysregulation. So how big a window of tolerance do they have for life events? Trauma, how do we respond? What are our coping mechanisms? And our core attachment style, how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we see the world, and how we relate to that. And that is formed within our family of origin. So when our family of origin breaks down, that has a massive impact on how we cope with the pressures of life. So in terms of family separation, about 50% of family separation will be okay. You know, there'll be a rough period where, you know, there's normal emotions of hurt and grief and anxiety and stress and frustration, but because they've got the internal working model to be able to know this is short term, I can get over it, and ultimately I am lovable, they're able to consistently meet their children's needs, regulate their own emotions and their nervous system. So the child, despite the breakdown, knows that they're lovable and loved by both parents. They are protected from adult issues. Their parents are able to support them through the breakdown, and there is a healthy co-parenting relationship which can be formed. That's in about 50% of cases. In about these are normally managed within universal services or within the family itself. Those that, for about 40% of cases, the parent is inconsistent at meeting the child's needs, which means sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not good enough. And they can struggle to regulate their emotions and oscillate between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So they're either quite relaxed and they can deal with it, or they're on high alert thinking that they're under attack. So therefore the child will feel unsure of themselves, what's happening in the future, and the parents can be preoccupied with their own feelings, leaving the child unsure how to get their needs met, and then that results in behavioural issues. So ultimately the relationship between the parents is unstable, and contact can be used to express their emotions, leaving the child feel abandoned. So when you've got that, what we're creating and what we've seen in our work is there's a transgenerational process here where children who have been in a relationship breakdown as a child, as adults, will probably experience a similar, if not worse, breakdown. So if we can deal with the emotional side of this, we're not just safeguarding children now in the present, we're safeguarding future generations from these issues. Unfortunately, in about 10% of cases, the parent is consistently unable to meet the child's emotional needs. They can't regulate their emotions, and they're consistently activated by their parasympathetic nervous system. So the child is fearful continuously. And again, this creates that transgenerational trauma that gets passed down. In my opinion, if we can bring in mental health much earlier in the process and, like Ben said, triage it, we can identify early on those that have the coping mechanisms, those that don't, but with a little bit of support, whether that be a mediator with some counselling skills, an understanding in attachment, they can be held without any intervention or minimal intervention from court. For those 10%, court is not the right place, because you're asking people with brain injuries to follow laws, and they can't do that because they're wired differently. And so the court just doesn't understand. They can't understand the court process. So if we need to introduce mental health as early as possible in cases where that they're identified as being in this high risk category, to, like I say, safeguard children, not just now, but from preventing this cycle being repeated later down the line.
Ian Maxwell, Shared Parenting Scotland, with its issues just come up about the importance of shared parenting, and he's going to tell us what the advantages are of a presumption of shared parenting.
I won't repeat what everyone has said so far, just put it on the record that we agree with everything so far. In terms of the APPG, the only principal area where the law affects all of us in the same way as in connection with child support, most MPs tell us that child support queries represent a substantial proportion of their constituency work. And I think that the CMS rigid system is part of the rigidity that besets all the other issues that have already been touched on, such as public health, mental health, legal issues, and so on. We've been trying to resolve that riddle for the last 13 years. I mean, what does come first? Change the law, change the culture, professional culture, popular culture, or change the public narrative? For the information of those who aren't paying close attention to what happens in the Scottish Parliament, we did have a go at changing the law in Scotland during the progress of the Children's Scotland Bill. We had several MSPs who proposed an amendment to bring in a rebuttable presumption of shared parenting, of equal shared parenting, but none of our amendments even got to a vote. The domestic abuse lobby was just too powerful to even allow it to be put to a vote. So what we're left with is parents, generally of those who get in touch with us as parents, adrift in a legal process, who are being asked to make long-term decisions for their children right at the time when they're least able to. The time of immediately after breakup is just the wrong time, whether it's to do with mental health or other stresses. They need support, a legal system and a court system that provided that support would be helpful. But other forms of support are important, because our feeling is that a large number of those who find themselves adrift and find themselves in opposition through the legal process are in other areas of their life, often quite reasonable people. So we have to look at what it is in the environment that they drift into, whether it's lawyers or the other sources of advice, who are assisting them to be unreasonable when it comes to putting their children, the interests of their children first. You asked us to speak about the benefits of the rebuttable presumption of shared parenting. I can do that in two ways. One is from our casework, and we do have a number of successes. In fact, I was driving down in Edinburgh just a couple of weeks ago and saw one of our guys walking along the street with his son, who is now about 7 years old, and he had been in court since the child was about 2 months old, and facing every uphill battle that could be put in front of him. But he stuck with it, and part of the importance of being able to sustain a rebuttable presumption of shared parenting is that it allows committed people to focus their efforts on their children and not on the battle. And the second area is that as Philip Marcus has referred to, and I see that Ben Hine has put into the chat, there are examples from around the world where other jurisdictions are addressing the same challenges, which are challenges to do with the change, the evolution of parenting itself, the evolution of economic circumstances of parents, and an understanding that the law is a crude instrument unless it is clearly focused on important issues and not facilitating conflict. So we've recently published a report pulled together by a student intern over the summer called Learning from Abroad. I can put the reference to it in the chat later. But really what we're interested in, and what we're focused on at this point, because we don't see any leverage in the Scottish Parliament for legislative change, is individual capacity building through our families programme, which encourages people to build up the their own emotional resilience, their own communication skills, and the feedback that we get from that is that the people who have done this course, the New Ways for Family course, are impressed at how much they can diminish their capacity for conflict with their ex-partner. And in fact, as they say often, they're applying the skills at work and elsewhere in their life as well.
We'll move straight on to Nav Mirza, who's heads Dads Unlimited. He showed me a rather disturbing image recently, which shows on the map of the UK all the people that they are helping, and in one colour showed all the ones where the dads are feeling suicidal, and there was dots of red all over England. So over to you, Nav.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this APPG. So I'm going to build on what most of you've already said, but take it one step further. So we've been going about 7 years. We roughly help approximately 800 to 850 fathers a year, and of course we have a father's lens, but the same applies to both mums and dads. I think the key for us is there is a severe mental health impact of family breakdown upon parents, but it's bigger than mental health. I think what we are trying to move this towards is it's a public health issue, because the issue of parental conflict and the impact it has upon both mum and dad, and of course the children, is phenomenal. And there are some key issues here as well, in the sense that pre-COVID, my team would look after a father going through the family breakdown system for approximately 23 to 24 weeks. Post-COVID, that rose to approximately 70 weeks. It's coming down to approximately 40 weeks, which is an enormously long time when you're supporting somebody in a mentoring capacity all the way through the family breakdown process. But the delay, and if they have not seen their children during that time, has a devastating impact upon that father's mental health, to the point where they feel like suicide is a reasonable option to leave the situation that they are in. And I think this bleeds into some other areas as well. Things around high-risk suicide triggers. We've been very lucky as a charity in the sense that we work very closely with public health, but also the King's Fund across the UK and GlaxoSmithKline, where we've been able to identify high-risk suicide triggers. The key ones amongst those are self-harm, relationship breakdown, loss of contact with children, debt, and bereavement. Now, in isolation, these are severe triggers in themselves. But what we have discovered in the fathers that we're looking after, they've got all of the triggers. They've got the relationship breakdown, and they've got the loss of contact with their children. They've also got issues around debt. And as we know, family breakdown and family litigation is extremely expensive. So that adds another layer of complexity onto that person. Then they have the interesting one, which is bereavement. Now, bereavement in and of itself shouldn't really apply. However, the work we have done with PH and King's Fund, if a parent is not seeing their child, it becomes a living bereavement. And therefore, them not being able to stay in touch with their children feels just as bad and just as difficult, because the grief of not seeing your kids is very, very painful. In fact, we've had many fathers say to us, they're watching their children grow up on their former partner's Facebook page. And then, of course, you've got issues around self-harm. And these men and the fathers that we are looking after, they're not self-harming in ways you would traditionally associate with self-harm. They could be very bad diet, exercising not at all, too much, maybe a bit of gambling, experimenting with drugs, drinking a bit more than usual, but not enough to get themselves onto the A&E secondary care radar. So these issues are extremely pernicious. And that's why we have tried to work on this from a public health issue. As I said, we roughly help about 8 to 850 men a year. 53.7% of the fathers we look after say in the last 3 months, I have felt suicidal because of the difficulties I am feeling because of family breakdown. And therefore, we put in early interventions straight away. We do a suicide risk assessment immediately upon triage. We then further triage them to ensure that they get access to our mental health support, which could be a counsellor, depending on their modality, instantaneously. But all of these things play into that very difficult construct that we have, that family breakdown, relationship breakdown, loss of contact with children is probably one of the biggest issues that affects their mental health. And not only that, their children as well. Having worked very closely with CAFCAS and the Family Justice Young People's Board, we speak to the young people on that board and they say the same thing. If they're not seeing their mum, they're not seeing their dad, they are equally part of that situation where their mental health suffers as well. And together we've got to do a lot more about this. I'm very lucky that I've been able to put some recommendations forward as a charity on family court reform and on some of the ideas that we have around trying to make the system more fairer, more kinder and more compassionate. But early access to trauma-informed support, not only from charities, but from lawyers, judges, anyone who's in the family court space, is vitally important, as well as access to therapy. And I think we don't understand that enough. That actually we've got to be able to mentally look after these parents who are going through what is a very, very challenging process. And I think in and of itself, we've got to realise that every parent going through the family breakdown process is vulnerable. And what we don't do is look at this as a vulnerability issue. We look at it as it's a life event. Yes, it is. But these parents are vulnerable and so are their children. And if we look at it with that lens, I think we'll be much more kinder and compassionate to looking after them and keep them out of court if possible. And we've got to also look at this with the child lens and think about, if you look at the coping strategies parents have or fathers have, we're adults and it's very difficult for us to cope with this, but we expect 7, 8, 9-year-olds to have the immediate coping strategies to deal with family breakdown, and the impact upon them can be tremendous. It's, as I always say, it's a tragedy. It's the difference between what was and what will never be. And I think ultimately what we have to do as a system, and hopefully through this APPG, is raise awareness of family breakdown as a public health issue, that these parents are vulnerable and that we need to give them a lot more support and understanding in order for them to navigate themselves out of conflict. Thank you.
So I'm going straight to Bob Greig, who runs Only Mums and Dads, and he's going to tell us how they offer support to families going through the divorce and separation process.
Evening, everybody. Thank you for the kind invitation to say a few words. Just a bit of background. Only Mums and Dads, as the name suggests, we deal with both mums and dads. We're a registered not-for-profit. We've been running for about 15 years, very much online. I'm going to try and keep what I say down to just a couple of minutes, if that's okay. Over those 15 years, we've had parents, mums and dads, ask us thousands of questions. Basically, not knowing where to start is a common one, not knowing where to find free advice. The range of questions we've been asked, quite an amazing range, but we narrowed it down 3 or 4 years ago. We did a collation of the data of all the questions we've been asked. About 120 questions keep on being asked year on year. Just in case anyone's interested, we put all the answers to those questions in this book, Separating with Children. Sir Andrew McFarlane wrote the foreword for that very kindly. That was written by about 100 and odd professionals, social workers, judges, solicitors, barristers, many of whom are on this Zoom. So thank you for that. That's a great resource for parents. It does cost money to buy it. At the moment, it's £10 for an ebook or £20 for the print copy. What we've been doing in the last few months is putting the content of this resource onto our family separation support hub. That's ongoing, that is online, and that's free to access. So parents are beginning to be directed there. The second overarching issue that we faced for years is parents think they have a choice of court or mediation. There are many more options available to parents. No one knows that. We worked with Joe O'Sullivan, a solicitor, produced another book, again with Sir Andrew writing the foreword, and that's called Almost Anything But Family Court. That was published last year. Since working on that book and hearing the feedback from the people who've read it, I get more and more convinced, as does my colleague Rebecca, family court is just not the answer. It sets up one parent against another with disastrous consequences, many of which have been illuminated by previous speakers. The other thing which we've heard, and this is in the background, but it's a constant grumble, that magistrates, solicitors, barristers who are working with parents or hearing cases do not seem to have a grounding in issues like attachment theory, child development. Well, just a final point, if I can. I think at a future APPG, it would be good to invite some representatives from the Parent Alliance to come along. The work we've been doing with James Hayhurst and others, I think could be, with a fair wind, truly groundbreaking. And that is looking for a culture change in the way we separate as human beings. Because we, and I put my hands up, we get it wrong. It's a very difficult thing to get right, and we do need that change in culture. And quite a lot of work is being done behind the scenes with the Parent Alliance, and I think their presentation may really help again illuminate the APPG members. Thank you for listening.
That's great. So can we just have a sound check to see if we can hear Helen speak?
Hello?
Yeah.
Is it echoing?
Just say a sentence.
Hi, is that all right?
Yes, it is indeed. So as we do this work, there will be changes suggested from two completely separate areas. One is changes to the way in which the courts may operate, but more importantly, changes to the way we can help parents come to their separation agreement without having to go to court. So, Helen is going to, from the Family Solutions Group, is going to talk about the fact that families looking for advice have nowhere to go. Helen.
Thank you, Mike. I'm not sure I've got anything particularly more to add to what's been said. We've heard Nav say very clearly that this is a public health issue. We've heard Sarah talk about the mental health approach that's needed. We've heard Ben talk about the need for children to see their dads, and the fact that we're not following the evidence in this country. We've heard, everything that has been said, I think everybody here agrees with. The truly shocking thing is that here we are, we have no parliamentarians in the room, and this is an issue that affects every single member of society in one shape or another. All of us here are either separated or a child of separated people or closely involved with friends or family. Everybody's affected. All of us here agree on what's needed, and yet everything we say falls on deaf ears. And we have had the Family Justice Review, We've had the Voice of the Child Advisory Group report. We've had the Private Law Working Group report. We've had the Family Solutions Group report. We've had Love Matters. We've got Ben's research. We've got everything says the same thing. Why is this of no interest to parliamentarians? And I think until it is, we all say the same thing and nothing happens. I find it extraordinary that every single MP is presumably having to face the difficulties of the family court and the difficulties of family separation and mental health support in their surgeries, and yet somehow nobody's interested. I just don't understand it. And Philip has told us about systems in Israel which seem to work better. There's lessons to be learned from Israel. There's lessons to be learned from a number of countries around the world, but there's absolutely nobody in government listening and learning. And we hear ministers trot out what's happening in Dorset and North Wales, but Dorset and North Wales are tiny, tiny, tiny parts of the population compared to the everybody. And the reality is it falls to voluntary organisations like Dads Unlimited, like Only Mums and Dads, like the professionals on the Family Solutions Group, and National Association of Child Contact Centres are here as well. We've got Two Wishes here. We've got Families Need Fathers here. We've got Parenting Scotland. We've got good people doing good things, all volunteers, all saying the same things, and it falls on deaf ears. And I'm utterly baffled. That's all I have to say.